Good evening, dear SwissCham members. My name is Chris Neff. I'm a member of the SwissCham in Singapore. Dear members of the Eurojam, guests and friends, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for another episode of our series of webinars on the new reality of travel. Earlier this year, within the board of the Swiss Chamber in Singapore, we decided to launch a series of webinars on the new reality of travel. The initial objective has not changed since then. It is to share some of the latest developments in the travel industry and also to bring clarity and transparency on the latest changes with regards to rules and regulations in order to improve your planning of trips overseas, be it for business or own personal travel with your families. Well, today we know that if one thing is certain in the last 18 months, it is the uncertainty. Patience, agility, and flexibility are key in all our planning. Well, the good news is that the travel industry is kicking into gear. Borders and quarantine restrictions are easing up with increasing vaccination rates, and people are ready to travel even as the pandemic lingers. In particular, with the recently established VTL concept, not only to Switzerland, but also to many countries around the world. On the other hand, this new reality of travel brings an enormous amount of complexity with it. Regulations from government, health departments, airlines, as well as airports. And as we all know, those regulations are not only complex, but are also changing on a daily basis. Together with our Swiss ambassador, Mr. Fabrice Fillier, and his team at the Swiss Embassy, as well as our industry partners, we are monitoring the situation closely. Today's webinar will focus on the VTL developments between Singapore and Switzerland. So for today's webinar, we are very privileged to have again industry experts on our panel. They will share with you their insights on the latest developments and will also answer your questions during the Q&A session. Our moderator for tonight's webinar is Ali. She is the Asia Pacific Regional Leader of the Integrations and Onboarding team at Braze, a customer engagement software company where she's working with clients across the travel industry. On behalf of the board of the Swiss Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, I would like to thank our esteemed industry experts in the panel, as well as our moderator for taking the time and share their insights into the new reality of travel. With this, I'm handing over to our moderator, Ali. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So next, I have the pleasure of introducing all of our expert panelists today. Firstly, we have Donald Tan, the Vice President of Market Development at Changi Airport Group. Next, we have Sabrina Winter, the Senior Director of Regional Sales, Southeast Asia and Pacific at Swiss International Airlines. Unfortunately, Ronald was not able to join us today due to an urgent matter, but in the event he is able to join at some point throughout the session, he's the advisor to the CEO in public affairs at Swiss International Airlines. Lastly, we have Reto Läderach, who's the head of the Consular and Administrative section at the Swiss Embassy here in Singapore. So you saw the agenda on the previous slide. To kick us off today, I'll hand it over to Reto to give an introduction.
Reto, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon to everybody, also from the embassy side. My name is, as already mentioned, Reto Läderach, and I am the head of the Consular and Visa section at the embassy. During the entire last year, or this year, we received numerous inquiries in relation with COVID and traveling to Switzerland or transit through Switzerland, Schengen visas, VTL, vaccination certificates, and many more. As we all experience, the situation and regulations can change on a very short notice and are still very fluid. If you have queries regarding your particular situation when entering Switzerland, do contact us and our team will guide you to the relevant information we usually get from the Federal Office of Public Health or also from the State Secretariat for Migration in Switzerland. We would also like to thank the Swiss Chamber for the initiative to host this webinar, and we are looking forward to the exchange and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Reto. Next, we'll have a presentation covering in-depth details on the vaccinated travel lane scheme as well as its requirements. This will be led by Donald from the Changi Airport Group as well as Sabrina from Swiss International Airlines. As a reminder, please add your questions into the Q&A function and we'll take them as we open the floor after the presentation portion. If there are any questions we're not able to answer, rest assured the team will answer them after the webinar in written form. With that, I'll hand it over to Donald and Sabrina.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Donald Tan from the Changi Airport Group. I'm from the Market Development Division. So very happy to be joining you this afternoon for this presentation on the vaccinated travel lane, or the VTL scheme for short. Next slide, please. So just to kick off the presentation with an overview of Singapore's situation with regards to how we are coping with COVID. So if you look at the chart on the left side of the screen, I think we are fully aware of the fact that Singapore has actually a very high rate of vaccination, with 85% of our population fully vaccinated as of now. And a few weeks ago, we also started the booster program as well. So as of the latest figure that we have seen, is about 24 to 26% of our population has actually received their booster shot as well. So as a result, I think this bodes well in terms of the level of vaccination across the country. And coupled that with the high degree of standards in our medical system, we are also glad to see that the percentage of COVID-19 fatalities in Singapore ranks as one of the lowest in the world. Next slide. So I guess in Singapore, we are all currently adapting to what we call living with COVID. And I think for those of us living in Singapore, I think we are very used to various aspects of life in general while living with COVID, but at the same time, being able to continue with as many of our daily life chores and activities as possible. So I guess what's very common in Singapore now and very habitual now for all of us is the need to check in and check out using our our Trace Together app. Wherever we enter premises, we actually have to wear masks all the time unless you are dining, or if you're exercising, or if you're smoking. And basically keeping in mind different safe distancing measures and group sizes in our social activities and in our dining in external venues. I think we are all quite used to that now. And I think pretty much life is pretty much normal. Right, we are able to go through, go to work. We are able to do our exercises in parks, and I think a very important aspect of normal life in Singapore is the fact that all schools are open. So as a result, kids and students are able to safely attend school in person in class. Next slide, please. So as a key business and tourism hub, Singapore has always recognized the need to reopen our borders to facilitate business and trade, as well as to reconnect families. And those are actually values that we at Changi Airport Group have very strong connections with. So with Singapore's pivot to living with COVID-19 achieved through our high vaccinations, low fatality rates, and general normalcy in our life, in our day-to-day life, Singapore is gradually reopening our borders in a safe and cautious manner. Next slide, please. So throughout the course of the pandemic, the Singapore government has been studying various approaches and frameworks on how to reopen Singapore's borders gradually. So today, Singapore has implemented a risk-differentiated approach by classifying countries and regions into 4 categories. And these categorizations are based on factors such as the rate of COVID-19 transmission and vaccination rates, just to name a few. So for each of these categories, differentiated border and health protocol measures apply. And so, for example, in terms of the lowest risk category, which is category 1, so countries and regions in this category can actually enter Singapore quarantine-free so long as they test negative on arrival. Whereas for slightly higher risk countries in categories 2, 3, and 4, by default, short-term visitors are not allowed into Singapore unless given special exemptions. And after arrival, they will have to serve what we call a stay-home notice, or SHN, but some countries call it the quarantine, for a period of 7 to 10 days, depending on the countries they come in from. Now, starting from September, of course, to enable a wider group of these short-term visitors to be able to enter Singapore, that's when we started the vaccinated travel lane, right, which was introduced for selected countries in category 2. So basically what it means is that if you travel on the vaccinated travel lane, short-term visitors will finally be allowed to enter Singapore. So I think just to, of course, be clear that this table is updated pretty often. So I think do check back with the websites of the Ministry of Health as well as some of our news channels to access the latest country categorizations, because these categorizations do change from time to time. Next slide, please. So just a summary of the key characteristics of the VTL as part of Singapore's gradual reopening. So as a prerequisite for entry, the visitors will have to have remained in the VTL country and or Singapore for the 14 days prior to arrival into Singapore. Of course, this VTL scheme also applies to Singapore citizens and permanent residents who have traveled out to these countries and they want to come back to Singapore quarantine-free. They will also be able to avail themselves to the VTL scheme. Passengers will actually have to be fully vaccinated with the World Health Organization emergency use legislation vaccines, which are recognized in Singapore, and the vaccination must be taken in any VTL country or Singapore. But of course, there is an exemption for unvaccinated children below 12, subject to certain conditions. Then they are required to test negative before their departure through a pre-departure test, and then also on arrival in Singapore. Then the latest development to this testing regime is which has just been announced and will take effect from the 3rd of December, is the requirement to take 2 additional government supervised antigen rapid tests, ART for short, on day 3 and day 7 of the arrival in the quick test centers. More information about this newest requirement can be seen in the MOH website. If you were to go to that website and the Ministry of Health website, and if you do a quick search on quick test centers, it will actually bring you to the link that actually shows you the whole list of test centers around Singapore, and there are more than 40 of them all around the island. Then they travel to Singapore on the VTL flights, which are designated. And then the other thing to note is that for short-term visitors, they will have to apply for a vaccinated travel pass, or VTP for short. So the complete list of requirements actually can be found on this hyperlink that you see at the bottom of this screen, which is the safetravel.ica.gov.sg website. Okay, so just a point to also note that the VTP application is actually not required for Singapore citizens and permanent residents. So all other entrants into Singapore under the VTL program will have to get the VTP applied for before arrival. Next slide, please. Right, so at Changi Airport, we basically have made the necessary arrangements and provided the necessary facilities to create a seamless arrival experience for travelers under the VTL scheme. And what you see on this screen right now is a summary of a typical customer journey of a passenger arriving on a VTL flight. So maybe just as an additional piece of information, our Changi Airport website has a comprehensive travel page that you can actually access at the link that's shown below. And essentially, you will be able to get more information about these steps that you have to actually go through as you journey through Changi Airport on your arrival. Next slide, please. So since September, we until now, we have already announced VTLs with 18 countries which have already been implemented, and the list of 18 countries and their flags are actually shown on the left side of the screen. And then we have also recently announced VTLs with 6 more countries, which will be rolled out progressively through the course of December, with Thailand commencing on the 14th and another 5 countries commencing on the 16th. The good news so far is that the results of as far as imported cases under the VTL program has been quite promising. So if you look at the data that is available when the VTL program was first started on the 8th of September until the start of November, the number of imported cases under the VTL program was only 0.1%. So I think this is quite a promising statistic, and of course we all hope that these results will continue as a lens of confidence that the VTL program is able to actually function smoothly and safely. Next slide, please. Right, so generally I think we have been actually quite encouraged so far by the progress of the VTL program in Singapore thus far. But of course, recent developments on the Omicron virus, or rather the Omicron mutant of the COVID virus has been a little bit disturbing for many of us. So I think right now, we are also taking a bit more caution in terms of rolling out the VTL programs moving forward. So I think while Singapore has that intention of opening up the VTL program to more countries progressively, at this point in time, I think the government has recently announced that there will be a pause to the further expansion of the VTL program for the time being, while they find out more about the nature of the Omicron variant and what other measures needs to be taken in Singapore, including whether there's any need to make any adjustments to the border measures. But other than that, I think generally the intention of the Singapore government to continue reopening our borders safely, I think still remains. It's just that right now, the government is monitoring the development of the Omicron virus carefully before any further next steps are taken. Okay, next slide. And I believe at this stage, I can hand over to Sabrina for her section. Thank you.
Great, a wonderful afternoon also on behalf of Swiss and myself, Sabrina Winter. I'm basically heading the sales department for Lufthansa Group, now today especially for Swiss. And I'm also glad that we are partnering up with Singapore Airlines in this joint venture to basically provide VTL options, or also to provide a travel corridor between Switzerland and Singapore. So I will just dive a little bit deeper, so we can start with the first slide, which is basically about our flight offer. And if you look into this slide, you can see that both Swiss and Singapore Airlines operate VTL flights. For Swiss currently, we are having VTL flights every Friday and Sunday, as you can see, departing at 1:10 in the afternoon. And only in the month of December, there will be the departure will be basically 1 hour later, but this is basically the timing you can stick to. What is Swiss also offers non-VTL flights. As you know, there might be people who do not obey to the travel history of these 14 days in a VTL country or Singapore. So then you would have to go on a non-VTL flight. That is on Tuesday, maybe just for you to remember. But now most of our fellow guests and passengers can obviously travel on the VTL flights, being vaccinated and mostly having a travel history in the VTL countries, which are, as Donald said before, quite a lot already. So you should be safe to go on the VTL flights. And the good thing with our partner airline, Singapore Airlines, is that you can basically travel daily into Singapore. So they have more options there as being the hub carrier of Singapore. So I would say travel options abound, and there's definitely the right choice for you. You can see they also depart in the morning at 10:35 every single day. So in order to stress on the next slide, what is really important, once again, I think it's very important to reiterate what is needed. We have had now already 2.5 or almost 3 months of VTL experience. What is really, really important is that you need to ensure that you have a proof of vaccination with you. This can be anybody who is vaccinated in Singapore, the digital basically certificate. Also, if you are vaccinated in Switzerland, you can carry along the Swiss certificate, which is both recognized by the EU DCC, so the European Digital Certificates, which is good because they are basically recognized mutually. And the proof of vaccination is required for any form of travel. So whether you are a citizen, a permanent resident, a long-term pass holder, or a short-term pass holder. What is also important is the pre-departure test. With the VTL scheme being more accepted now, you can either take a PCR or an antigen rapid test. So that's more an alleviation to what it used to be 1 month back. So we now also allow antigen rapid tests, and they have to be taken 48 hours before your departure flight. Also needed for all forms of travel and all types of travelers. In comparison to, so if you are a Singapore citizen or a permanent resident, you do not have to do that. But if you are a long-term pass holder or a short-term pass holder, you need to apply for a vaccinated travel pass. This can be done 7 to 60 days before your intended entry into Singapore. So there you will also have to upload your certificate and all different information. So just make sure you get that, because you're only allowed to board a VTL flight if you have a vaccinated travel pass. And also just one important thing that I also want to mention, if you're on a non-VTL flight, the vaccinated travel pass is not eligible. You need a different form of entry granted by the ministry. So the VTP is solely for VTL flights. Then apart from that, so if you're here for a short term, basically we want to, or the government wants to ensure that you are also insured against COVID, just to make sure you have a safe travel experience and not any obstacles here in Singapore. So please make sure you get your insurance policy with you, and also valid visa only for those who need a visa upon arrival. So usually the EU countries do not require that, but there might be other nationalities on board, or you might just take, coming from another country, a flight from Switzerland. So please ensure that you also abide by the visa entry regulations. Just, this is also, we had similar cases in the past where it didn't work out. So just make sure you are aware of that. So this is basically to your safe VTL and smooth VTL experience. And on the next slide, I'm gonna talk once again, because it's very important, about the pre-departure test, which can be both a PCR or an ART. It's up to you. What you just need to make ensure is that it's in English, and it states, as mentioned here, both your name, the date when the test was taken, the test result, and there should also be another identifier. So the name definitely has to be as on the passport, and an identifier could be, for example, your birth date, just that we can really ensure that you are the person traveling and this is your pre-departure COVID test. If you have children below the age of 2, a pre-departure test is not necessary. Then heading into the vaccination certificate requirements, again, this also has to be in English, and it also needs to have your name as on the passport and another identifier. As said, date of birth, passport number, can be anything. And the country of issuance must be either Singapore itself or any VTL country. And obviously it also has to state the vaccine name and when was the last dose taken, because the last dose needs to be taken at least 14 days prior to departure. So this is also important. And if you have recovered from COVID, 1 dose usually is sufficient, but that needs to be taken 28 days after you have recovered from COVID-19. Exactly. And now, as Donald also already said, because to just fight the new Omicron variant, it's also important that there will be a post-arrival ART test on day 3 or day 7 in the test centers. The on-arrival PCR test has been there before. So that's a very smooth experience. You can pay ahead of time. Actually, it's recommended to pay the PCR test upon arrival before you actually travel. And it's a very smooth experience. I've also already had 2 nice encounters, and that's super safe and super fast, I would say. Good. And then what is also usually bothering many people if you ask you around in Singapore, so how do I actually enter Switzerland, or what do I have to be wary about? So that's on the next slide. Again, I mean, Donald mentioned it, or even Reto, it's very volatile, the market right now, but currently, state of today, you need to complete your entry form. That is usually open up to 48 hours before departure, just that it's very up to date. And you need also to present a vaccination certificate. And as said before, with a Singapore certificate, if you got your vaccine here, this is basically accredited by the EU DCC basically mechanism. So you can enter Singapore without any worries. Switzerland, sorry, you can enter Switzerland without any worries. And usually it's now the 4 main vaccination providers. So it's AstraZeneca, BioNTech, Pfizer, Moderna, and now also Sinovac and Sinopharm to enter Switzerland without any problem. Please be reminded, though, that not all vaccines grant you access thereafter in restaurants and so on. So with the Singapore vaccination certificate, you can also enter restaurants and so on because it's mutually recognized. If you have, for example, from another country or so, a vaccination certificate, let's take any country, Indonesia or so, then you need to ensure that you get, in order to enter restaurants, facilities in Switzerland, you need to get also a COVID certificate by the canton, so by the area, and this is usually valid for 30 days only. So please be mindful that just because you can enter Switzerland, you need to check if that is also valid for the facilities in Switzerland. But with the Singapore certificate and the Swiss or a EU digital COVID certificate, you basically can enter facilities as well. So this is important. Yes, and you do not need basically a test or an entry form if you just transit in Switzerland. That's maybe also important for some of you. Yeah, so I talked about already the Swiss COVID-19 certificate. And if you have any questions, again, so Travel Check is the best source to go to. There is the latest information on there. And if you are not vaccinated, then you would also not be allowed to travel on the VTL flight. But nevertheless, you can always send an email to singapore@eda.admin.ch. I think that's important. Right now, if you are not vaccinated, you need to take a test beforehand, for example, 48 hours ART, 72 hours PCR test. So that's important, maybe to know if you are not vaccinated. And with this, I really hope you've gotten a better understanding of what is required to travel between Switzerland and Singapore. And I think we will open the room for Q&As, but I will first hand over to Ellie. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Donald and Sabrina. So we did have some questions coming in as you were presenting. We'll start with actually the first one that came in, and I believe this will be a question for Donald. So what is your assessment of any short notice cancellation of VTL to Switzerland or Germany due to significant increase of cases in those countries, plus the new Omicron variant?
Thanks, Alex. Difficult question to answer because unfortunately the airport itself is pretty much a recipient of instructions from the government, if I have to put it very frankly. I think at this stage it's just a question of the assessment that the government is actually making right now in terms of the Omicron virus. Obviously, they are monitoring the developments all over the world very, very closely. Of course, there will be a mechanism internally for them to actually make an assessment if there is a need to adjust any of the border restrictions. So, or rather the border measures, including the VTL program. So unfortunately, I'm not in a position to comment on the likelihood of any adjustments to that, but because this is really the responsibility of the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Transport. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions come in also around the EU vaccination certification. So I'll kind of summarize two of them into one. They noted, thank you for clarifying Singapore's vaccination certification being interchangeable with EU certification. Do we just show the vaccination certification after getting it notarized? And is there no need to convert any documents? Maybe for Sabrina or Reto?
Yeah, maybe if I can, let's say the ordinance in Switzerland has been adapted, means the Singapore certificate is also accepted in Switzerland. Now it's very new, so means in practice we do not have yet the feedbacks how it really works. But let's say the ordinance has been adapted, and this is, let's say, important. So this is the way to for the travel to Switzerland. And as I said, at the moment, yeah, we are waiting also a bit for feedbacks, but because usually we get feedbacks if there are problems, if it does not work. But as it's very new, we do not have any experience to share with you at the moment. Only that the ordinance in Switzerland has been adapted. Yes.
Noted. Another question that came in, possibly for Sabrina or Reto, is the ART is recognized in Singapore. So again, that antigen rapid test, but do the clinics or hospitals in Switzerland support ART tests? The website states PCR tests so far.
For this question, this one I don't have really the information. This one I have to take back for the ART from my side. This is, let's say, for Switzerland side, but then when you come to Switzerland side, I really have to take back because ART we were not confronted yet actually, as also it's a new regulation from. But this I will take back, and I suggest that we reply to this question in written.
Great, thank you, Reto. Another one for Donald. How long does it take to receive the VTP?
The VTP is actually processed by the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore. So I actually can't give a very specific answer, although I have heard, I think maybe Sabrina could help me on this one, because I think it's approved pretty literally right on the spot, right? If I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. So I actually
if everything checks out.
Exactly. Yeah. So I actually signed up myself for a VTP 2 weeks ago. So a good example. And the approval is immediate. So it will tell you if anything is missing or the QR code is, for example, we had cases before where, let's say, the two vaccines were too close together. So then it will show you actually it's too close, and then you need to text the ICA, so the Immigration Checkpoint Authorities. So there's a link on the Safe Travel website, which most of you might be familiar with. You can always text if there's any questions or if it doesn't allow you to go through. But if you have uploaded everything according to the rules and regulations, it's immediate. And it's also valid for 6 days the moment you have gotten your approval. So if your flight is delayed or something, you can also come in the next day. If you, let's say you booked the VTP for entry on the 2nd, you can still enter up to 6 days thereafter. So this is also good to know. So you do have a little bit of flexibility, but please make sure you are within this time frame. Because we had that cases where people entered on the last day and then there was a flight cancellation, let's say. We didn't have this case, but it might happen. Then you would have to apply again, and you need to make sure that it's between the 7th and the 60th day before departure. So maybe I would suggest to have a few days before and a few days after for entry if you're not 100% sure. But yes, it's immediate. Unless, if not, the system will tell you with the link where you have to text your worry. I can give you an example. For example, in my first time, it didn't work because I was only vaccinated in Austria, because I'm Austrian and Austria is not a VTL country, so it didn't allow me to upload my Austrian certificate, but I had to upload the Singapore certificate. So you will encounter different cases, but it's very straightforward and you should get immediate approval.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions around what's happening if I test positive while in Switzerland. So I'll start with one of those, a multi-pronged question, maybe for Sabrina or Donald, because there's a couple of questions within this question. So what happens if we test positive in Switzerland while doing the pre-departure PCR test as designated by Singapore prior to coming back? And then the second piece of that question is, can we change our flight to a non-VTL flight, or do we have to go to a specific clinic in Switzerland?
Reto, do you want to take the question with Switzerland regulation?
Yes. The part I can, yes. Okay, when you are tested positive in Switzerland, then actually usually also according to the Federal Office of Public Health, you have to self-isolate also. Means that, but this you do at home or in the place where you stay in Switzerland. So actually you would have to self-isolate then in Switzerland when you have a positive test result for the time being till you have a negative test then. But you do not have to go to the hospital, let's say, mandatory. It's really a self-isolation then, except of course when you have severe symptoms, then you of course have to go to the hospital. But if you have mild symptoms tested positive, it's a self-isolation. Yeah. This is from this point what the information I have, yes.
And I mean, in terms of changing flights, as you can always change flights, but there are different regulations that come with it. Yeah. So if you are on a, and I wouldn't, like, let's say, I'm just wondering if what would be a good legitimate reason. If you fulfill all the criteria, I wouldn't see any benefit in you taking a non-VTL flight, because then mostly you have to quarantine. And now with Omicron, even some categories, so let's say category 2 countries have been recategorized as category 3, just an example. So you would have, for example, now 10 days quarantine instead of 7 days quarantine. So really make sure where is the country you are departing from if you are traveling on a non-VTL flight. And then again, the VTP is not valid, so you need to get an entry of approval by the government. So there are different conditions that come with it. So if you now recover, so you anyway need to recover first. So I would still recommend to stay on a VTL flight if you're eligible for a VTL flight. There's a lot of hassle involved if you want to change from to a non-VTL flight. From an airline perspective, that works obviously, but it's just to weigh the cons, benefits, and the advantages and disadvantages.
Maybe if I could just add on the to what Sabrina mentioned about VTL flights versus non-VTL flights. So definitely there are different conditions applicable, and I think the other thing to remember is that I think as far as Singapore citizens and permanent residents are concerned, you are allowed to enter Singapore regardless. But it's just that depending on which type of flight you take, your entry protocols will be different. So if you take your VTL flight, then you'll be subject to the normal arrival testing, and then you will self-isolate until you get a negative result and you're free to go. But if you take a non-VTL flight, that will basically then subject you to SHN, whether it's if it's category 2 country like Switzerland is right now, then it would be served at home. So there is a difference, and the difference actually is in the arrival and the follow-up protocols. Now, the other thing to note is that for short-term visitors, then it's also very important to note that for short-term visitors under the VTL program, they can only take the VTL flight. They are not allowed to actually take the non-VTL. So if they're on the wrong flight, I believe they are not allowed entry into Singapore at all. So that's a very important piece of information to take note of. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was a multi-pronged one. Another question that we have specific to Swiss Airlines is, what is the Swiss Airlines refund or cancellation policy should the VTL be suspended before travel? Oh, I think you're
Yes, I was on mute, sorry. So usually this is, I wouldn't call it force majeure, but usually we would be evaluating if we can offer free cancellation. I mean, we are right now in the process, although, I mean, I'm also talking to a lot of stakeholders, and we really hope that the VTL for the countries who are already on the VTL will persist. I mean, Singapore has publicly announced that it's really the way forward, a role model in the whole region. So, I mean, in case there is such a decision taken, which I, fingers crossed, don't expect right now, then we will definitely inform all our passengers right ahead, but there should be a certain flexibility attached to that. I agree, because it's not anybody of ours fault. It's the virus and the new variants coming in. And yes, we are working we are monitoring the situation very closely.
Excellent. Another one when it comes to flights. So the question is, at the moment, costs for VTL flights are rather high, regardless of Christmas. What is your assessment? Will that change in the foreseeable future, even with more VTLs in place?
I mean, airline prices always depend on the demand, right? How many people want to travel on a flight? So definitely not COVID, I would say the VTL per se hasn't increased the price. It's just that we have less capacity in the market as the airlines are still ramping up. And due to the high demand compared to the capacity, you might sooner pay a higher price. But I would say with increased capacity, it should balance again, right? It's always a demand thing. So it also depends very much on the travel date you want to travel, but it is indeed true that December and January are very heavy traveler months, right? I mean, we have on the one side a lot of people who want to go home and reunite with families back in Europe or back in Switzerland. On the other hand, now with the COVID situation in Europe, we do have some people who just say, I want to get out of Europe and enjoy a few days on the VTL in Singapore. So this is one of the most popular travel seasons, I would say. But generally, you cannot say that prices increased. So this is really just a demand thing and the lesser capacity compared to pre-COVID times. But I mean, we are also evaluating as soon as we see spikes and more people also willing and ready to travel. I'm sure we are all considering more capacities or to put more capacity in the market.
Excellent. Another question came in, potentially for you, Reto. The FOPH ordinance has now removed Singapore as a low-risk country. Does this mean tourism will no longer be available for a tourist to enter Singapore, or excuse me, Switzerland? Yeah,
for tourists, if you are vaccinated, it's still possible to enter Switzerland. If you are not vaccinated, then for tourism, it's not possible at the moment. But for other reasons like business, like It's quite a large catalog of exceptions then, and this is where we really ask you, if you have a particular situation, to contact us, that we can take a look at your situation and then inform you. But as a vaccinated person coming from Singapore, you can still enter Switzerland as tourist or also for any other reasons. And then, of course, Swiss citizens can always return to Switzerland, and so this is also a point. But this is true at the moment. If you have a particular situation, contact us. But as vaccinated, you can always enter Switzerland as before. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Additionally, another one spanning multiple flights. So is it possible to travel to a number of countries as long as they are all in the VTL scheme and using VTL flights? For example, Switzerland, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, back to Switzerland.
So, I mean, the VTL is always basically a unilateral agreement to enter Singapore, right? So, depending on what your last destination is, you always have to make yourself familiar with the country regulations when you enter. But let's say for entry into Singapore, you are allowed to travel between these VTL countries on the flight. So for example, you could go from, I don't know, I'll take Switzerland, then you go to the UK, and from the UK you fly into Singapore on a VTL flight. That is correct. So basically the travel history has to be between Singapore, VTLs, and also category 1 countries are allowed. So if you check the list that Donald showed before, or you can also find that on internet, the classification, those countries are allowed. VTL category 1 in Singapore, and it doesn't matter how long you stayed where. So for example, it's 14 days that you would have to stay in a VTL country. If you just go to Switzerland for three days, it's fine from Singapore because you've only been to Singapore and to Switzerland. Yeah. And always be mindful if you go VTLs, again, they regulate the entry into Singapore. Some are unilateral. So for example, in the case of Switzerland, it's unilateral because Switzerland decides on their own entry requirements, and they do not have the reciprocal entry requirements as Singapore. It might be different for example, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, or that's why really be mindful of the country you are traveling to. It depends on the country. There are different regulations.
Yeah, maybe I could just add on to Sabrina's reply. So yeah, I think it's important to check the entry requirements of the next point that you're going after Singapore. Because for example, for Kuala Lumpur, it's actually a very unique route to take it as an example, because there are only 6 designated flights a day between Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. So if you want to enter Malaysia under a VTL program, because the Malaysia one that we have is actually, I believe, a bilateral one. So there is also a specific list of flights that you are allowed to take. And if you and there would be, that there could potentially be other entry requirements or entry restrictions if you are not on those flights. Whereas in the case of Thailand, when the Thailand VTL comes about, yes, the VTL is only applicable for the flight into Singapore. So again, the passenger would then have to check are there any specific flight restrictions for entry into Thailand? These will have to be taken into consideration when the traveler potentially plans his or her trip. Thanks.
Great. Another one, as it relates to tourism, and I think maybe for you, Donald, this rings similar to the first question that we had, but talking about tourism, how likely is it that the VTL with Switzerland or Germany will exclude short-term visitors from entering Singapore due to new COVID-19 variant or increasing cases in Europe?
So at this stage, the VTL program in its current form allows short-term visitors. Yeah, so I think so once again, I can't comment on how the border restrictions or border policies will evolve with the Omicron virus. But what I can say is that the VTL in its current form allows for short-term visitors. So if there's any change in that policy, then I think potentially the whole the whole ability on a VTL might also have to change. So I think, but I have to emphasize that this is actually not something that I'm in control of. But at this point in time, the VTL in its current form still allows for short-term visitors. Thanks.
Great. Another one, so recognizing we don't have a representative from Singapore Air directly here, but this one is regarding the Singapore Air app. Under COVID-19 travel restrictions, it seems Singapore has been removed from the list of allowed to enter for Switzerland. Does this mean that we cannot enter Switzerland?
Reto, I don't know. So I might start. So I cannot, I'm also not in the position to comment on the app, but let's just go. We will anyway. We together with Singapore Airlines are always trying very hard to keep everything updated. But I think this refers basically to the high risk classification of Singapore, I could imagine. So Reto, please elaborate on Switzerland. But for example, I know on Germany, until a few days ago, Singapore was on the high incidence country list of Germany, which would basically mean that if you are not vaccinated, or also if you travel with children, your children would have to quarantine because it's a high incident country and they are not vaccinated. But if you were vaccinated, or if you are vaccinated, still, even if it's on the high incident or high incidence country list, then you can travel in there. The only concern, and I think it's the same for Switzerland, if you're coming from a mutant area, such as South Africa or Southern African countries right now, then you would still have to quarantine. But just because it's on the high incidence list doesn't mean that you cannot enter. In these cases, if you're vaccinated, you can enter without a problem.
Yes, if I can add also, let's say it's a bit what we said before. The list you have is actually that what we said before. If you are vaccinated, you can enter Switzerland coming from Singapore. As Sabrina said, Germany has taken Singapore from the list again. But the other EU countries, as far as we know, not yet. And Switzerland is always a little bit later with these decisions because then it's always internal consultations. So it will take usually longer. As I said, basically, it is, as we said before, that vaccinated people can enter. And this, I think, it's the most important point from this situation at the moment. It's strongly possible that there will be changes again, but for Switzerland, as I said, it's always a little bit later than the decisions from the European Union due to internal consultations back home.
Noted. The next one we have is around entry to Switzerland and those requirements. So potentially for you, Reto, does Switzerland require travel insurance covering COVID to enter the country for Swiss residents?
For Swiss residents, no, but for the, let's say, for the Schengen visa applications, people who require to have a visa, they have to present a travel insurance, yes. But for Swiss, we do not, it's not required. It's not mandatory.
Great. The next one, if I take a Singapore Airlines VTL, and transit, this one is another transiting one. So transiting from a few different countries and go for a week and have a holiday in Switzerland and then return to Singapore on a VTL flight, will I be allowed to book such an itinerary? So I think the question for this one is again around the countries that you'll be traveling to. Potentially was already answered in Sabrina's answer previously, but I don't know if there's anything that anyone else wants to add on in terms of transiting from multiple different countries, then to Switzerland, then to Singapore.
Maybe just to add to also my comment from before, on the outbound flight, so departing from Singapore, there is no VTL because VTL regulates the entry into Singapore. So you are basically free to take any flight outbound, so ex-Singapore. And then let's say you stay 2 months in Europe, you can basically go anywhere, even to non-VTL countries. You just need to ensure that the last 2 weeks before your departure into Singapore, you spend in a VTL country, before you depart to Singapore, or a category 1 country, basically.
Great. Another one, a unique one, so we'll see if we can answer it, or if not, it may require a bit more research, but the COVID Cert app is recommended to us. Can I check if there are plans to allow the Singapore vaccination certification to be transferred into the app?
Could you repeat the name of the app? Sorry.
The COVID Cert app? Or COVID?
Okay, the COVID certificate app, probably. So, I mean, there are so many different apps, and also the IATA health certificate that has also started or has launched already. So, I mean, Singapore is very well advanced with the mutual recognition of certificates. That's why they also have this EU DCC mutual recognition. So we would have to check. I mean, we can get back to the person, and yeah, I think that's the best way, because there are too many apps, and I'm also not in the position to really comment on that with 100% certainty. But I think Singapore is well underway. They are very much invested into this digitization initiatives.
Excellent. Potentially more of a forward-looking question here that we may not have an answer to, but we'll try to address it for you. So the question is, if one hasn't received a booster, for how long will the vaccine be valid under the VTL? So I think this is getting at, will the VTL eventually have requirements around a booster?
So actually, I was in discussions with the Civil Aviation Authority this week. At the moment, there is no expiry date, but they will inform us. So I guess in Switzerland, the vaccination is valid for 365 days. And Reto, you can comment on that, but that's what I read only yesterday. But at the moment, there is still no booster requirement when you apply for vaccinated travel passes, but I'm sure there will be updates along the way, and we will definitely inform our both customers once there's a new regulation.
Yes, if I can add, at the moment it's true, it's 365 days valid, the certificate after your last vaccination, but it's not specifically mentioned about the booster. So I think there more information will come.
Excellent. And then potentially a quick one for you, Sabrina. If I test positive, how can I contact Swiss Airlines for assistance while in a foreign land?
I would just reach out to the service line. I mean, if you go onto the website, I think in for both airlines, you have the service hotlines there, and they will be glad to assist you. It also, I don't want to comment now on how many days you have recovered, because it changes quite heavily and it's different with every airline. So just make sure to ask also about how many days you have to have recovered before you can take the flight, and any of our services people will assist you.
Great. So we actually don't have any more questions at this point. We can give it a couple of minutes to see if any more questions come in. Otherwise, we may be able to wrap up right on time. Oh, one more. All right, a couple more questions did come in. So we have, I noticed Switzerland has created a list of countries with a concern of variant, and they take effect almost immediately. What if the news was announced while we are on the plane on the way to Switzerland? Are we still affected by those implementations? No one wants to arrive and then be informed to serve 10 days quarantine that was announced while we were on the plane.
I mean, again, if you look, I will just comment now on Singapore. If you look at Omicron, you always usually have a 1 or 2 days lead time. So all the new regulations will only be effective tomorrow at 23:59. So usually it's also the same with other countries. So if you're on the flight, I highly doubt that they will already apply the new regulations upon entry. I'm not saying it might never happen, but usually there is a short lead time before that.
Great. And one, I believe this was answered earlier, but I'll ask it again just for good measure. So a similar question came up previously, but one that just came in was, if Singapore gets listed as a country with variant of concern by the FOPH, can a vaccinated tourist still enter Switzerland? I believe the answer was yes.
It's mutual country, or I can anyway check the.
Yeah, the question is maybe a little bit. It has to, because there are different lists, of course. But if we talk about the new variant, yeah, there of course. But then you also have to make. If you go on the website of the Federal Office of Public Health, if you enter now from a country with a new variant, then persons over 16 years have to have a negative PCR or RAT test. This is also then for vaccinated and persons who had COVID. So there will be a slight difference, but this is why the question is a bit for me not that clear. Then if we talk now, when we talk about the new variant, then there might be slightly different conditions then to enter. So this is, but I would really, yeah, as Singapore is not on this list, I think it's at the moment not speculation a little bit, and also the requirements, of course, can change again. So they're really also, if you enter the website of the Federal Office of Public Health, it's actually the first message you get there in red and yellow. So it's quite the newest information then. So I hope this is okay.
Got it. There's one more question now. How easy is it to reapply for VTP should one not be able to go ahead with a booked VTL flight initially? Same procedure, or are those VTP applications limited?
Not that I know of. So also in my case, I was not able to travel on one flight I was planning because of this Omicron variant. Personal reasons, but I could easily apply again. I mean, I didn't even have to cancel my old VTP. It will just expire and then you can reapply.
Great. Another one for the departure from Switzerland to Singapore, is ART test sufficient, or does it have to be PCR?
Now for VTL flights, it's also antigen, so ART is sufficient. You just have now the new, because of Omicron, also the ART tests on day 3 and 7.
Maybe just to add, I think the requirement as far as ART is concerned, it has to be supervised. You can't do a self-administered ART. That I think that's the only condition, that it has to be a professionally administered ART.
Very helpful. We do not have any more questions in the Q&A right now. All right, so to summarize, thank you everyone for attending today's session. You have a lot of resources at your disposal as per the discussion, but definitely please check the Travel Check website for any information. You can also reach out directly to the embassy via the email address shared here as well. So there's a lot of information that's published out that you'll be able to leverage as you start planning your trips as they're coming up as well. So with that, I think I'll hand it back over to the SwissCham team and Chris to close us out.
Well, I'm glad that we covered a lot of grounds, a lot of questions online. I think there are a few topics that need a bit more detail in order to have a very clear answer. But other than that, I hope we achieve the objective of today's session by bringing some clarity, some transparency of what we know based on today's situation, taking into consideration that it is very volatile at the moment. It can change, which is obviously not in our hands, but we will inform you and update if there are changes. Other than that, I'm going to thank all our panelists to take time, share their expertise, and also to Ali, our moderator. So let's hope that we have some kind of stability in the planning for your travels. If you plan to go to Switzerland for Christmas or any other destination, we wish you safe travels and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone.